Hi, I'm Greg Farrar. It's July 3rd, and this is my COVID-19 Trends live stream. I'll do a section on the countries of the world, followed by a section on the states of the United States, followed by a section on the counties of California. Let's go right into the countries. This is completely, there we go. Ooh. I sometimes experience technical difficulties. I was hoping I was going to not have zero graphs for this live stream. There is, by the way, a chat box or a chat, and you can put stuff in there, and I might see it. I've been known to not notice the chat for the entire time because it's not very visible on my screen, but with luck, if you ask for something, I will see it. Okay, so the countries. United States, having more cases than anyone and accelerating. Brazil, having the second most cases and slightly accelerating. Brazil was looking okay for a minute there. Looked like it might actually turn the corner towards recovery. At this point, it's showing just the slightest sense that it's heading upwards again. Russia seems to be okay. India continues to accelerate, though it has very few cases per million. Let's look down here and see. Do we even have India in here? Yeah, one of these days I'm going to make a graph that shows daily cases per million for all countries. But for now, we'll just say that India has so few cases relative to its population that it doesn't even register on the daily cases per million graph. It doesn't mean it doesn't have a lot of cases because it's really, really big. But adjusted by population, which is my favorite way of looking at things, gives you a sense of how bad a region has it. And by that, India is not even on the radar. But it's rising, so eventually India will actually rise into these top 25 in daily cases per million if it keeps rising. And then it'll really have a lot of cases. So, in terms of the countries that have it worst, as always, we have Qatar and Bahrain as the top, and Qatar is looking much, much better. It certainly has been the worst in the world, but you look at that curve. That is a classic recovery curve. Linearly up, briefly peak, linearly down, a little bit slower than it went up. That's the typical recovery curve. It actually seems to be dropping just about as fast as it rose. Bahrain, on the other hand, is clearly flattening out, but hasn't quite gotten there yet. We have a recovery curve for Chile. Chile had it pretty bad. It was one of the Central South America cluster. Chile is recovering, and Oman and Panama not obviously yet. Oman just keeps showing up there. Oman is a hot spot. All of these are hot spots, actually. We have quite a few. We have a few world hotspots. Bahrain is the biggest now, since Qatar has recovered quickly and is not too long for hotspot land at that rate. Another week maybe it'll be out of hotspot. Oman, though, has risen into hotspot territory and continues to rise. Same with Panama. Panama right now is actually looking worst it's the worst in Central South America right now, having just passed the recovering Chile. And then there's Armenia and Brazil. Brazil, not a hot spot, but awfully close. And then there's everyone else. I guess we could take a look at Kuwait there. Kuwait, I'm going to just zoom in on that for just a minute because Kuwait is interesting. It hit hotspot territory, seemed to be getting better, and now it's flattened out again and is showing some signs that it may return to hotspot territory. But it never had a really sustained recovery. Those who've been listening for a long time here will know that, especially for the past few weeks, I've been harping on the idea that once a region recovers, it does not typically see a second wave. And this is a case where it didn't complete its recovery, and so I don't know that this is exactly an exception to that, but it's something like an exception. It seemed to peak, it seemed to be getting better, and now it seems to have lost its grip on the recovery. But the big picture of the world is really, the world is not doing that badly. There are some hot spots, but several of them are recovering. And even Bahrain, if I pop down to here, Bahrain is not doing that badly. It's barely growing, and it's been trending downward. So the top two countries, that's, by the way, is a glance at a chart I'll talk about in a minute, a new graph. But Bahrain is certainly on its way towards recovery, seems to be peaking right about now. Chile recovering. And so the only really trouble spots in the world are Oman and Panama. Neither of them are super large countries. This is in terms of daily cases per million. Now, that's not to downplay the importance of the United States, which is shading towards being a hot spot, but because of its rather large population, even as a warm spot at 133 daily cases per million, still has a lot of cases, as we saw in the first graph. The United States is kind of dominating the world in the total cases. So, as we go on, let's take a, no, I'm not going to go there quite yet. I probably should put that graph after this one. Here we have the rope chart, and this is also a somewhat promising chart. These are the countries in the top 25 countries in daily cases per million. Let me see. Okay. By the way, I have recently traveled and hung out with people from such hot spots as Texas and Alabama, and therefore I'm masking up anytime there's anybody close to me. And just for a minute, there is someone else in the room, so you may see me mask up and mask down, but I'll keep the mask off as long as I'm alone in this room. So the rope chart then, the rope chart kind of looking good. Well, it depends on how you look at it. In one sense, a lot of countries are growing. Everyone above zero, more than half of the hottest countries are growing. On the other hand, the trend, the angle of the graph to me looks like it's downward. Like there are more lines angled downward than angled up. Even the lines like Iraq here, which is still growing, but it shows a solid downward angle. I'm just going to look at some of the biggest ones. Bahrain recovering. Qatar long since turned the corner and very much recovering. Oman also, as we saw, one of the big ones, but recovering, turning a corner right now towards zero growth. Panama showing just the slightest sense of recovery. It has a slight downward tilt to its growth graph. So though it's growing every day at 2%, it is trending downward in growth rate. So tomorrow might be 1.9. So still good. Chile, very good. Shrinking and accelerating downwards. Armenia has turned the corner. Brazil, we have to get as far as Brazil down this list to finally find a country that's hot, reasonably hot, and growing and at least slightly accelerating. So Brazil did cross zero, as I recall, a week or two ago. It was looking good, but it definitely has lost its grip on recovery and is now growing again at almost 2% and slightly accelerating. It's not a huge acceleration. We'll see in the states section that there are states like Idaho or even Arizona recently that grow at 5 to 10%, sometimes even more. And so a growth rate of 2% is not that much, but it's something. It's not a recovery yet. And then Kuwait is definitely not recovering with an even higher growth rate and extending and continuing upwards. Kazakhstan is kind of stable, but at a pretty high 4%. And then we see the United States. So once we get down to the United States, this is what a bad graph looks like. The United States has a bad graph, 6% daily growth. 6%, let me see. 1.06 to the 365, is that right? Yeah. If I'm not mistaken, if this were to persist, 6% growth for a year, we'd see. No, that can't be right. Well, maybe it is. It'd be a lot. Let's just say it'd be a whole lot. We would have a lot of cases. This will not persist for a year. No one sees 6% growth for a year. But right now, the United States is growing very quickly, very quickly. It is a hot spot in growth, and it's accelerating. And it's pretty close to a hot spot in daily cases per million, too. So the United States, definitely the news of the world right now, looking very bad. I have a new graph. This is a little bit different from the other graphs I've seen. I've been showing. And this actually is, I really made this for the states, but then I figured if I've got the code, I may as well show it for the countries as well. And I've seen graphs like this. I think Our World in Data maybe has a graph like this. The point of this graph is to compare the trajectories of different countries. So starting from the moment that they got 100 daily cases per million, which is to say the moment they got warm, where have the different countries gone? And you notice this country list is relatively small. We have 20 or something, less than 20 maybe countries on this list. And that's because only 20 countries have ever gotten warm. There's been, and I find it fascinating that Italy is not on this list. That for all the doom and gloom we heard back in the day from about Italy when it first had it, before the United States did, about how terrible this thing was and how much they had, Italy has never exceeded 100 daily cases per million. It's never even been warm by modern standards. So the United States, we'll see in the states section, there are 30 states or something that have hit 100. And so the United States really has it a lot worse than Italy. If you look at something like this, Qatar, we've talked a lot about Qatar, small country, but wow, did they have a big epidemic there. So starting at 100, they grew till they hit 700. And by the way, another way this is different is this is a 14-day moving average line, so it wiggles a whole lot more than our usual lines, which are this trend line, nonlinear fit trend line. So we get a lot of wiggle here, and it makes it kind of ugly, but I played around with this a bit yesterday to try to figure out how to make it a little smoother, and haven't quite managed that. So this is what we got for now. So Qatar, that really just stands out as this is how bad things can get, and how bad things have gotten. And even Bahrain, which Bahrain is really very bad as well, but it's nothing like Qatar. And then we have Chile, which interestingly really rose up there for a while. You notice that some of these lines don't go all the way to the right, and that's because the end of the line for each one of them is today. But the dates are not aligned on this graph. This is what makes them different from every other graph I've got. The aligning factor on this kind of graph is that day 0 was the day they reached 100, and they all reached 100 DCPM at different times, and then it shows their trajectory going forward. This is actually more interesting in the case of the states, where we can really see a trend of how states tend to evolve. But you can see, for instance, Peru. It does kind of weird things when you zoom out, because it tries to redraw the whole graph to fit whatever you're zoomed in on. So I'm not going to turn off all the other lines. But Peru here shows a fairly typical recovery graph. It hit 100 at some point, and then it rose a bit, never got hot. It got to about 170, and then it dropped away. And at this point, Peru is barely warm, having dropped for a while. And it took it, by the way, I'm saying it will take it about 50 days to go from 100 back to 100. And I am going to zoom in on some of these individually. Qatar hit 100, very much an exception, but it looks like it might take it about 90 days to get back to no longer being warm. Let's look at the United States. Oh yeah, see, this is what's weird about this graph. The United States only became warm 4 days ago. You might not know it living in the United States, but though there have been some very hot states, the country as a whole has never even reached 100 daily cases per million until just 4 days ago. So this graph at this point is worthless. It just means that it just got there, and so there are very few points. But here's another classic curve. Switzerland hit 100, peaked, and then recovered back to 100. In this case, it took it only 14 days to get there, and the recovery since there has been great. Sweden actually is weird. Sweden is weird. Sweden hit 100 just a little bit ago, and it's been waving around there ever since. Spain, though, is very much like one of the other European states. They hit 100 eventually, and there was a lot before they hit 100. But those that actually got that bad hit 100, peaked, and then recovered back to 100, and then have leveled off since. What else do we got? In Belgium, also doing the same thing. It took about 20 days for its 100 to peak and then go back to 100. I have the ability to do this from when they did hit 50, but I think I actually get better numbers, better looking graphs, a better filter when I do it from when they hit 100. So this is, this will be more interesting when we do it by the states. But as time goes by, these will lengthen. We'll be able to see if new countries reach the 100. We'll be able to see, is there a trend for how they tend to behave? And there is, broadly speaking. They hit 100, they go on for a few weeks, peak, and then drop away. And Peru is maybe classic case of this. It took a little longer than some other countries, but as we'll see in the states section, when this happens for a state, it tends to take about 60 to 70 days after a state hits 100 before it peaks and recovers. All right, so we'll keep an eye on that graph. It's just it's a way of comparing how bad a particular state has it, and of roughly predicting, or a particular country has it, roughly predicting where it's going in the future based on what the trajectory has been of other regions. Okay, we've looked at this one. The rope chart of the world as a whole is pretty evenly balanced around zero. A lot of countries rising, a lot of them falling. As we'll see when it comes to states and counties of California, this is relatively a good rope chart, because for the states and the counties right now, it seems like everyone's growing. For the world as a whole, not so much. The world is growing. You can see it here as a whole in total cases. And in fact, it's growing by about 2% a day, which is quite a high growth rate, but that's mostly due to the United States. The United States growing at 6% a day really pulls those world numbers up. It wasn't that long ago when the world was near zero, but that was back in the day when the United States was looking better. Do we have that? Yeah, back in those days. Remember those days? Back when the United States was having all these days of all this negative growth for a long, long time, very slowly seemed to be recovering. Then everything went south. So, all right, testing, blah, blah, blah. So the world doesn't have a huge amount of news except to say the United States is looking bad. And Central South America is looking better, is recovering. The United States is not recovering. So let's move on to the states, where we can see why the United States is not recovering. And it is, of course, because some of the states are not recovering. And in fact, what the real answer is going to be is that a whole lot of the states are not recovering. So New York in my data set, this coviddatascraper.com, is just all whacked. And I'm just going to take it out of here. Suffice it to say, New York's total cases are not dropping. That's not possible. There's some sort of a split brain thing going on in this data set, where New York sometimes thinks it's way up here and sometimes thinks it's down here. Really, as I believe it is way up here, but whatever. I'm going to get rid of New York. The rest of the states seem to be fine in this data source, but something's weird about New York. Take New York out of it and California dominates. In total cases, California has more than anyone else, not way more, but more. And you can see from the way the dots are outpacing the trend line that it is accelerating pretty rapidly. And we'll have a whole section on California where we can see why. Texas and Florida also looking pretty bad in the way they're rising way above their trend lines, and also Arizona is doing that. Illinois is a nice one where it's recovering. New Jersey also flattening out, and Massachusetts. Let's move on to daily cases per million, one of my favorite ways to look at things. Adjusted by population, who are the real problem states? Well, Arizona. So Arizona has been in the news, as it should be. Arizona, as we'll see in multiple places, is worse than everyone else, and it continues to be worse than everyone else. There's some very small indication that Arizona is getting better. If you look at yesterday's blog, you can see some of the graphs are starting to bend down just a little bit. It's certainly not visible on this graph, and we'll see a little bit later today that that's happening for the Gang of Six, the 6 worst hit states right now. Actually, not right now. The worst hit states are no longer really the Gang of Six. We have 15 or so other states that are coming on strong. The Gang of Six are the 3 A states: Arizona, Arkansas, Alabama, and the North and South Carolina and Utah. Arizona is still pretty problematic. And you can see South Carolina, which is also very problematic. So recall that warm is 100. And I've been calling 200 hot. There are a number of hot states right now. Let's just zoom in a little bit to get a sense of who's hot and who's not. No, actually, when I zoom in, I see there really are only 2 hot states at this point. In terms of daily cases per million hotspots, we only have Arizona and South Carolina. There's a whole mess of wannabes down here, but none of them have reached 200 daily cases per million. They're all warm. Let's zoom in on just to look at who's warm. Okay, so looking at who's above 100, we see a lot of them are warm. And only one of them, Iowa, is obviously recovering out of warmness. The rest of them all seem to be heading upwards, though at somewhat different slopes. So just to run through the list, Arizona, South Carolina, really ahead of the pack. And then there's a whole cluster of somewhat, not, I'd say very warm states: Florida, Arkansas, Alabama, Louisiana and Mississippi, Texas and Utah, Nevada and North Carolina, Tennessee, Georgia, California, not doing quite so bad. There was sort of a horse race here between Texas and California for a while. Texas wins or loses. Texas is way ahead of California at this point in daily cases per million with 170, whereas California is down at 110. However, California is finally warm, at least. For a long time, it seemed like California just wasn't going to make the news, at least my news, because it couldn't even manage 100 daily cases per million. Now it seems like everyone's doing 100 daily cases per million, and California is one of them. Okay, first of all, so here again is that graph that I've been talking about making for weeks and finally put together. Very different from my other graphs. I described it in some detail in the previous section, but in case you just tuned into this section and skipped the previous section, this graph shows the trajectory of all states which reached 100 daily cases per million. So all states that are or have ever been warm are shown in this graph, and where they went from there in daily cases per million. Now, this wild ride here is Rhode Island. I'm just going to take it out of here. I think the data is a little whacked on Rhode Island. In any case, Rhode Island is super tiny. And so we've talked a lot about Rhode Island. It has definitely had a very serious problem adjusted for population. But I think that it really just confuses the trend. Kind of like Qatar. Rhode Island is the Qatar of the United States. So the reason I wanted this graph is because if we looked at the Gang of Six a week ago, again, Arizona, Arkansas, Alabama, North and South Carolina, and Utah, we looked at those, and there was some, I would say, hysteria maybe in the media saying, oh no, look at these states, they're rising so fast, everything's terrible, we're all going to die. I don't know. And I doesn't see it. I can't say for sure that that's not going to happen. I mean, we are in fact all going to die, but probably not this year because of COVID-19. And yet, if you look at Arizona, you see there's some cause here for alarm. And we've seen this. Arizona has had a problem. For Arizona, there is some cause for alarm. It hit 100, and then in a mere, someone keeps ringing a phone on my computer. All right, go away, phone call. In a mere 25, I think that is, days, it has beaten everyone else. And so again, these are all shifted so that the very left side is when each state hit 100 DCPM. And so there's no, the bottom is not a date. The bottom is the days since reaching 100 DCPM. And so this graph allows us to compare the trajectories based on when they started. So if one state, like New York, for instance, let's just look at New York. New York will be here. I'm going to flash New York here. The green line here is New York. Actually, for just a minute, I'm going to turn everything else off. New York hit 100. It rose to, it hit it whenever. It doesn't matter. This doesn't even show. It rose then to peak at 300 some, very, very hot. And this is a 14-day moving average, by the way. So it actually averages out the real peak. I think there were days in New York that were over 1,000. But the average peak was at 300 something, and then it dropped away back to 100 in about 45 days. So there's a trajectory of one, and it's never come back. This has been the drum I'm beating, by the way. When a state gets COVID-19, it has something that's sort of a metaphorical immune response, which eventually it'll rise, it'll overcome it, and then once it has recovered, its immune system remains in place so that it never sees another wave. This is almost universally true. It's too soon to say that it never will, but so far we've got a fair bit of evidence that states that recover do not come back. And you can see New York has it's pretty solidly recovered. It's been at 15 or something for days and days and days and days, weeks and weeks. So that's New York. Let's look at New Jersey. Similarly, put on the same axis. New Jersey hit 100. It peaked in a few weeks at about 500. It recovered at about 65 days, and it has not come back. Let's look at some other northeastern states. Delaware. I'm going to actually show just Delaware because it starts getting complicated. Delaware eventually got warm. It kept growing. It peaked. It overcame the problem. It at 54 days in, it returned to the 100 line, cooled down. After this, it was no longer warm, and it recovered, except for this little thing. So is Delaware going to be an exception? Maybe. We're seeing definitely something that looks short-term, like it may be a new wave coming in Delaware. Now, my theory, which has limited evidence to back it up, but some, is that this is not going to go to 200. Delaware it already has an immune system in place in the form of testing, in the form of people's fear of getting the virus and having experienced it already. And so as Delaware sees a resurgence, it's going to very quickly activate all those systems that helped it overcome it in the first place. And it's going to knock it down pretty quick. So say I. But we'll see. Delaware is one of the two exceptions. In other cases, there's just no sign that it's coming back at all. Connecticut's another good example. It hit 100. It took several weeks, 20 days, before it was able to put a lid on it. It recovered a little bit slower than it rose, and 56 days in, it cooled down and dropped below 100 again, and has never come back. There's a tiny tail here, but not really. So again, what we're seeing over and over for the New England states, so the Northeast states, is they hit those that got warm, and by the way, states that have never hit 100 aren't even in this list, though it's really alarming how many are, considering, as I mentioned before, that Italy never hit 100 at all, It's kind of crazy that so many states have it so bad here in the United States. We have a broad-based pandemic happening in the United States. So, but there are some states that have not hit it at all, have never hit 100, and those don't appear in this graph at all. But the consistent thing we see is those states that do hit 100 take, let's say, about 30 days, maybe a little less in this case, to solve it, or to peak, to stop growing, and then they have about 30 days until they hit 0, and they go below, or hit 100, they go below 100 and never come back. All right, so put that now in the context of something like Alabama. So, what can we predict? If you look at Alabama, if you just look at Alabama, you might say, oh no, Alabama's going up and up and up, and there's no sign that it's ever going to stop, and they're all going to get sick, and 1% of them are going to die or something. But we have many graphs like this light blue line that say that's not what happens. That's not what has happened. And therefore, may I project that's not what's going to happen. What's going to happen if Alabama moves like any of these other states is it's going to rise. It will peak somewhere, could be as soon as now, as it was in the case of Connecticut, might be at 30 days, maybe 40 days at the latest. So sometime in the next 2 weeks, 3 weeks, Alabama will peak. It will drop down back to 100 around the 60 to 70 day mark, and then it will recover and never come back. The never come back is an extrapolation. I can't say for sure because we certainly we don't have infinite future data to say any state never came back, but we can say that there are a lot of states which recovered many, many weeks ago and have so far not come back. So if it follows that, maybe I'll say it won't come back for the month after it hits 100. Maybe that's more what I can actually say given the data I have. Or let's continue looking at the Gang of 6, Arkansas, similarly doing this thing, 21 days in. It seems to be rising sharply. It is rising sharply. Can we project that it's going to peak and head downward? Well, I do project that. It will peak and head downward because everyone has. Arizona, really alarming, Arizona. Arizona is at 400, 450 daily cases per million, and it's been rising like nobody else. You look at the whole graph of everybody, minus Rhode Island, and you see Arizona has created its own world here. Nobody at 25 days past 100 has been this bad. Now, New Jersey was a little worse, maybe Rhode Island was worse, but Arizona is pretty much in a category by itself. However, if you look at, say, the green line, New York, or the blue line, Massachusetts, or the other blue line, Connecticut, you can see the trend has always been it rises and rises, it peaks somewhere around the 30 mark, and then it drops. Will this happen to Arizona? I believe it will. I think it will. We'll see. Among the other gang of okay. Yeah, I'm gonna put another graph on this so we can see more of the trend. Connecticut is a fairly typical graph. Starts, peaks, recovers in about 60 to 70 days. I'll just throw another one in here as well. Tennessee, I don't know what Tennessee's done. No, it's new. Tennessee is just starting. What about something like Michigan? So Michigan is rather different. It never actually got it as bad as some of these, but it did hit 100, peaked not very high, recovered in only 20 days, and has gone down and never come back. There was this weird bump here, but that almost seems like a data anomaly. In any case, did not get it above warm. So Utah, of the Gang of 6, already showing some signs of flattening out. Utah and North Carolina are the two out of the Gang of 6, as we'll soon see, that are showing a real trend towards recovery already. And you can see that just barely in this graph. It's starting to turn downward. Indeed, it seems to have flattened. Pretty short term, but it looks like it may be hitting a peak. Though, you look at this graph here, there was a little peak here that didn't turn into anything. So maybe there's more to come yet. Nevertheless, if Utah follows a typical trajectory, it'll peak in the next 10 or so days, it'll head downward. It'll hit 100 at 60 to 70 days, and it will drop below and either never come back or not come back for a while. All right, so that's my main point really, is with this graph. The reason I wanted this graph is just to show that there's a real tendency of all the states to go upwards, and you see the graph gets very thick around the 30 point. That's where these states tend to be peaking. Where most states peaked is around 30 days after they hit 100. They peaked, the graph's very thick, and then it goes into this bottleneck at 60 to 70. And that's where none of them were warm anymore, with the, I guess, single exception maybe of Massachusetts. Almost nobody was warm at 60 or 70. We got something interesting happening with Iowa as well. So there's this envelope effect where they can go very high for a few days, for 30 days, but eventually they kind of get forced downward by something. All of them have gotten forced downward by some force. What is that force? Well, this is what I am calling the metaphorical immune system of a region. It is testing, it is the fear of the people, it is people staying inside and wearing masks and social distancing. Those probably are part of it. It is the governments mandating certain things and shutting down businesses and locking people in their houses. I don't know which of those are most effective. Some of them may not be effective at all, but something, and it could even be the literal immune system of the population, the biological immune system, but I don't think it would have an effect that fast. Whatever it is, though, in every state, we have seen this downward pressure that has forced the curve back to 100 in a matter of 60 or 70 days. So I've spent a lot of time on this graph. I will just show you one more thing, which is the exception that proves the rule. I don't know, I'm not going to go into the etymology of that phrase too much, except to say that prove in that phrase does not mean that it indicates that it's true, but it means that it tests the rule. The exception that's proving the rule, that is to say testing the rule in this case, is Louisiana. Louisiana is certainly an exception to this, and there's some hint that Delaware may become too, as we saw earlier. I'm going to show you the Louisiana graph. So Louisiana graph looked fine. It looked kind of typical. It hit 100, it peaked, it recovered very quickly in only 23 days back to 100. In some sense, it never super duper recovered. If we compare it to something like New York, New York, once it hit 100, went down to 15. Whereas Louisiana never made it much below below 100. It did make it below 100, but it hovered around 100 for that 50 or 60 days that we're used to seeing as the recovery point. But now it's very strongly heading back upwards. So this is definitely a second wave happening. This is an exception, and this is a clear counterexample to the theory that I've been putting forward, which is that once a state gets it and recovers, that it never comes back. I guess I could say that Louisiana just never recovered because it was always around 100. But something's weird happening here. It's different from the rest. So will Alabama do this? Maybe. I don't know. But we do see it. We do see a trend here. I think the trend is pretty clear in this graph. Let's get Rhode Island, also an odd exception, though it's never really recovered. But the trend is pretty clear in this graph. But it got at least one or two that are not behaving according to the usual trend. But that does make 25 that are. So if we want to predict the trajectory of Alabama, I would probably go with the way that 23 of the 25 went, rather than looking at this. But as time goes by, we may see more and more breaking out of this rule that we've seen, that once recovered, they never come back. Okay, cool graph, eh? Thank you. So moving on to the rope chart. Rope chart's terrible. This is looking as bad as California. This is what we've been seeing in California counties. Of the hottest states, the ones we've been looking at in two graphs up, the 25 hottest in daily cases per million, almost everyone is growing. This is the 0 mark. Any line above here indicates that a state is growing. If it's angled upwards, it is accelerating. The only ones in those top 25 that aren't growing are Louisiana, which is recovering nicely, interesting. I want to take another look at this because we've just been talking about how Louisiana is breaking. No, that wasn't Louisiana. I was just grabbing a particular dot that I thought was the purple line, but it was a Louisiana dot. Worth noting, where was that Louisiana dot? I don't know. I can't seem to grab my purple line here. Who is it? Who's the purple? I'm going to zoom in just to try to grab this one. Wow, it's really hard. Puerto Rico. Okay, Puerto Rico is small enough that it has a weird exceptional line. I'm going to move on. Of the other ones, pretty much everyone's heading upwards. North Carolina, the only one that's really trending downward, and Utah. Now, this is interesting because North Carolina and Utah are part of the Gang of Six. These are the 6 states that were really making the news 2 weeks ago because they were growing and they were growing faster than everyone else. At this point, the Gang of Six, Arizona, Arkansas, Utah, North and South Carolina, and who else was it? There's another A, Alabama. The Gang of Six is looking better. You can see that Alabama is flat pretty much. They're all growing. They're all above the 0 line here. But they used to all be sharply angled upwards, and there's a definite sense, I can see it, that all of these are bending downwards as they go to the right. And these ones, which were trending upwards, the bottom 3, they were trending upward just days ago. Some of them are literally trending downwards, and this one's flat. So 3 of them are peaking on the rope chart. Once they've bent downward and crossed 0, then they'll peak in the total daily cases chart. Arizona's still problematic for sure, and South Carolina. These are the worst 2. Growing 6% a day, that's not good. But it's not as much as it used to be. I think they were growing 9% a few days ago, so these I think are bending downward, and then Arkansas also getting a little better. So what we're seeing is this wave, the Gang of Six wave, is passing. This is just the very tip of the trend that points that way, but I'm reasonably confident, given what we've seen over and over, that the Gang of Six wave is passing. These are going to bend downwards. If you look at it in 2 weeks, they'll all be pointing downwards, and they will have been passed by everyone else. Now, if we actually look who everyone else is, it's Idaho. Idaho is extraordinarily bad right now at 10%. We almost never see 10%. 10% accelerating rapidly, and we can generally see there's just a lot of very hot growth states right now. A lot of new ones that we haven't heard so much about. Well, Guam, but also Idaho, as we mentioned. Florida has been in the news. It's really bad in Florida. Nevada. And then we have Kansas. There are just a lot. And anyone above 1% growth, which is right here, is a growth warm spot, which means that everyone's a growth warm spot in this top 25 list. So we're seeing a broad growth trend across half of the states. So the Gang of Six are going to die away, I think, and that leaves another 20 right now that are growing strongly. Those also, from what we've seen, let's just take a look at Idaho, for instance. And let's go back to this other graph and see, what is Idaho doing? It's not even going to show up, right? Yeah, Idaho is only 2 days old. 2 days ago, Idaho hit that 100 mark. So it's shooting upwards, passing 100. Who knows how high it'll go? But I'm guessing, I predict that within 30 days, it's a while, but within 30 days, it's roughly at 30 days, Idaho will peak, and another 30 days, it will have dropped down to the 100 mark, and then will go below and probably not come back again. So Idaho is one of the very newest of this wave of 20 states, huge number of states. There were 15 or so that got it in the early Marches and Aprils, and the northeast wave, and now they're and then there were the 6 or so, and kind of everyone else is getting it now. And so I don't think we're going to see a lot of states that will escape COVID-19. I think we're going to see them all on this graph eventually, and I hope and expect that we're going to see them all follow this trajectory of about a two-month period from warm, crossing into warmth to crossing out of warmth. So this graph looks terrible, but at least we are seeing evidence that the Gang of 6 is recovering. And that's just more evidence that everyone does recover eventually. And once this latest wave, the new wave of 20, once it recovers, the good news is there aren't many states left. There may be 10, but there just aren't many states left to get it. So that means that 60 days from now, assuming things go the way that some of these graphs indicate they will, we will have run out of states to get warm. They all will have been through their warm cycle, their first wave, and unless second waves really exist and are as bad as first waves, we should finally see the United States start to drop, because there just won't be any new states left to infect. If we look at the total rope chart of all the states, we can see a little bit of evidence of this, where there's this cluster at the bottom, and this is the very first. These are mostly northeast states: Massachusetts, Nebraska, Maryland, New Hampshire, Vermont, and then some other New Jersey, Connecticut. So these are the first wave states that are still shrinking. Mostly. Some of them are, they're below 0, so they're shrinking. There's a little bit of a sense like New Jersey is trending upwards, but as long as it stays below 0, there's going to be a little bit of wavering below 0. It has very few cases. So this is where the first wave ended up, 90 some days later. The second, from the second waves, Michigan and so on, where is Michigan here? Probably also looking pretty good. Well, actually, Michigan isn't looking so good. What's Michigan doing here? What is Michigan doing here? Well, if we look at this graph, what is Michigan doing? Okay, this is a slight. Michigan is showing a slight upward trend, but only slight, and only up to 35. So 100 again is warm. Michigan was stone cold, and now it's just cold. So there can be some wavering around here. Will this lead to a new warm wave? I'm guessing not. I think Michigan has the infrastructure in place to prevent this from ever getting back up to 100, but we'll see. But it does mean that we'll sometimes see something like this, where a state is growing, but it's not a big deal because it has very few cases, especially if it already has all the testing infrastructure to overcome it. My computer, by the way, is quickly running out of power. Something is eating a lot of power, so I may literally have to. Well, it's already 50 minutes in. I've done my my entire usual time. Okay, I'm not going to get into testing much today. I'll just say that when I was looking at this earlier, I was looking at these graphs earlier today. The Gang of 6 and some of those other ones are also the ones that are showing the highest hospitalization rates and rising. And they're showing the highest positive test rates and rising, which is kind of interesting to me because there's some evidence they're recovering, and yet we see hospitalization rates and positive test rates rising, which is evidence they aren't recovering. So maybe those data just lag. But the newest ones, like Idaho, actually I'll just head back very briefly just to see what is Idaho doing. Idaho, our poster child for the very latest wave, just having gotten warm a few days ago, but rapidly rising. What is Idaho doing in terms of positive tests? This page is reloading. Give it a second, as I went to the counties and then went back. Okay. Testing daily. Testing continues to rise everywhere. In the immune system metaphor, testing is the antibodies, and so the antibodies are being built everywhere, metaphorically speaking, which is good. Arizona, very, very high still and rising testing rate. I was wondering about Idaho. Positive test over 10% is problematic. Idaho. Okay. Yeah, Idaho hasn't yet. You can see some pretty high days, but the trend line hasn't yet quite noticed. But I'd say it's probably above 10% if we were to draw the trend line through this mini trend and up into here. So Idaho is coming online, seeing more, seeing its test rate rise. All right, my battery's running out. I'm not plugged in, so let's move to the counties quickly. The news of the counties is the same as the news has always been in the counties. Los Angeles is huge. Counties of California, let's do it by daily cases per million. We still see Imperial and Kings as the big contributor, though Kings seems to maybe be dropping away, but Imperial is just outrageous, as it always has been for many, many weeks. 900 daily cases per million. That is, remember, 200 is hot. It's got 900. Which other counties are hot? Well, we've got Kings, Tulare, Riverside, San Joaquin, and Los Angeles. Again, you can come and look at this yourself on gregfarrar.us. 8% on the battery. It's a race against time. All right, and this is the same graph. I'll just say Imperial has been doing crazy stuff up there, as has Kings. They're both showing a little bit of a downward trend. No county has been hot for the 60 to 70 days that would allow us to, or has been warm for the 60 to 70 days that would allow us to compare counties to states. But it's certainly plausible, given that they've peaked, and that they peaked in the 40 range, not too far off the 30 we've seen for states. It's plausible that we may see similar trends in counties that we've seen in states, but we just don't know yet. We're seeing a lot of these things rising. San Joaquin actually is especially ahead of the ball, as is Fresno, but I'll just show Los Angeles's graph here, just to say Los Angeles has just become hot and is going up. No good news from Los Angeles. The county's graph, as I mentioned, looks like the state graph. It's more like the state graph looks like the county graph, because the county graph has looked like this for weeks. Every county is growing. Most of them are accelerating, but there are some, you can see some downward lines. Don't have much time to look at this, so I'm not going to focus on them too much. But Imperial, as always, as the growth rate drops, Imperial is shrinking, has turned the corner. Nobody else has in the top 25. And when we look at the really busy graph here, which is all the counties, or at least all the ones that aren't tiny, we can see that almost nobody is shrinking. Counties, almost all growing. Yuba is completely off the chart, but counties, they're just growing, they're accelerating. California is in the midst of an epidemic. It looked like it was maybe not going to get bad here for a few months there, but California has caught it. California is not as bad as some. It's hot, I think. California turned hot. Maybe I think California just turned warm. It's nowhere near like the New Yorks and so on where they've been, but it's growing, so it might get there. So we will watch. That's right. Yeah. When we looked at that offset graph of I'll call it the trajectory graph, California just has a tiny little sliver because it's only just gotten warm. So California isn't in bad shape in terms, because it doesn't have that many cases adjusted for population, but its trend is certainly looking bad across all counties. All right, that's the news. Bad news for the states, bad news for California, middling news for the world as a whole. We're certainly not over this thing, and California and the United States are still growing strong, but there is some evidence that there's a consistent trajectory that any particular region that gets over it within 60 days and never gets it back. We've seen that in the country level as well. I'm Greg Farrar. Thanks for watching.